This is a presentation about the coming of World War II, especially with regard to the United States. We're not going to go into all of the causes of the war in Europe and in Asia, but we are going to focus on how the United States became involved in the war. Um, the United States, after the bad experience in World War I, was extremely anxious to stay out of the war. If you think about what was going on in the country in the mid 1930s, there was a terrible depression. Uh, we did not want to be involved in another European war. So Congress passed neutrality acts that said no U.S. weapons could be provided to nations at war. And the United States would not loan money to nations that were at war. Um, and then we began to modify that somewhat. In 1937, we said, okay, we will sell uh, products to Britain. First, it was non-military and later military products. Uh, but we remembered what had happened during World War One, which is that American ships had delivered those things, and many of them had been sunk by German U-boats. We also were not sure uh, how well Britain was going to be able to repay or to pay for the cost of those goods. So we instituted a policy of cash and carry. What that meant was they pay cash for it up front, and they send their ships to pick up the materials and carry them across the ocean. That way, we're not risking losing our money, and we're not risking losing our sailors and ships on the North Atlantic. In 1939, on September 1st, war broke out in Europe when Germany invaded Poland. The United States at first was determined to stay out, and in fact, the U.S. did stay out of that war for more than 2 years. But at the same time, sympathy was growing for Britain. We had many historic ties to Britain, and we certainly were not sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Most Americans were not anyway. So the American policies begin to change after that point. In June of 1940, France fell to the Nazis, and that shocked a lot of people in the world because France was a major military power, and they didn't put up a very good resistance to the German blitzkrieg. So they fell with astonishing swiftness. And at that point, Britain was alone. The Soviet Union had not entered the war yet. They had a non-aggression pact with Germany. So Britain was alone against Germany. And Germany then bombed them mercilessly in what became known as the Battle of Britain. And this included bombing cities, the Blitz of London, for example, and killing civilians. And there was a tremendous amount of U.S. support for Britain, but not to the point where we were willing to enter the war. What the U.S. did do was to send 50 old destroyers, World War I destroyers, to Britain in September 1940, because destroyers are the natural enemies of U-boats. And of course, the U-boats were trying to starve out Britain, just as they had in the First World War. Then the U.S. took a step beyond this, a significant step in March of 1941 with what was called the Lend-Lease Act, where we basically provided military supplies and hardware to Britain. It was going to be repaid, but we didn't demand cash up front. There were two groups in the United States who opposed each other on the question of entrance into World War II. The isolationists, such as the America First Committee, basically took the attitude, what goes on in the rest of the world is not our business, it's not our concern, let's just focus, let's stay home and focus on our affairs here. The internationalists said that we can't ignore the rest of the world, that we have to pay attention and we may have to be involved. And they were led by the president, Franklin Roosevelt. Now let's shift for a few minutes over to Japan. At the same time that these events were going on in Europe, there were other equally concerning events that were going on in Asia. Um, just a little background. The United States pressured Japan to begin trading with the rest of the world in 1853. And following that, Japan industrialized rapidly. And one sign of that industrialization was their ability to defeat Russia, a major European power in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. And in a way, that was a signal that Japan had arrived as a major industrialized power in the world. Uh, as World War II approached, the well, first of all, in World War I, Japan joined the Allies. They were opposed to Germany, and after the war, they gained some German colonies in that part of the world near Japan. In the 1920s, Japan was more democratic, more peaceful, but then the Depression came. It spread to really all of the industrialized countries, including Japan. Uh, and at a time when there was a great need for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, uh, the power in Japan went over to the military. They challenged the civilian authorities and they took control. And because Japan is poor in natural resources, the military argued that they needed to move into Manchuria to gain more natural resources. So, against orders, the military simply went into Manchuria, invaded it in 1931 and 32. There was still a civilian government in Japan, but it could not control the military. Now, in 1937, Japan invaded China, and there were atrocities in what became known as the Rape of Nanking and elsewhere. The wholesale murder of perhaps 300,000 or more Chinese people, most of whom were not even military, including many women and children who were simply massacred by the Japanese. Um, and Japan was also very interested in gaining more colonies in that part of the world. And after the Netherlands and France, for example, fell to Germany, Japan uh, sought to take advantage of its alliance with Germany to expand its empire. And they were able to expand their empire. And they called it the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. They appealed to other Asian nations that this was a mark of freedom, that they were being freed from European domination, colonial domination. But I think most of the countries saw through that and realized that this was just a new kind of domination. It was domination as part of a Japanese empire. Uh, in September 1940, after the war had begun, about a year after the World War II had begun in Europe, and about 3 years after it had begun in China, uh, the Japanese allied with the Germans and Italians. This, of course, is before the U.S. was involved in the war. Uh, in April of 41, they entered into a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. In the same way as the Soviets had worked out a deal with Nazi Germany, they worked out an agreement with Japan that they would not attack each other. Eventually, the Soviets did come into the war against Japan, but not until the closing days of the war in August of 1945. Now, over the course of the couple of years before Pearl Harbor, the relations between the United States and Japan went downhill. They deteriorated badly. The Americans were sympathetic to the Chinese and the very poor treatment that China was receiving at the hands of the Japanese invaders. Uh, One thing the U.S. did was to end scrap metal and steel exports to Japan because As we've said, Japan was poor in natural resources and needed these materials. They took a very aggressive step in freezing Japanese assets in U.S. banks. That means money that Japan had in American banks was frozen. They could not get at it, they couldn't access it. And finally, the United States stopped oil exports to Japan. Believe it or not, in as late as 1941, the United States was exporting oil to some countries. We had more than we needed. Imagine that today. But Japan was short of oil. We were selling it to them. That stopped in 1941. There was a new prime minister in Japan, General Tojo, who was very militaristic, very aggressive. Uh, and at that point, given the economic conflict, in a way, economic warfare that was going on between the two countries, the United States expected an attack from Japan, but did not know where or when it would happen. There have been conspiracy theories that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor before it happened. Most historians simply don't believe that. There's simply not good evidence to support those theories. Now, as we know, Japan did attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And the question is why? It was a very risky move to make. Well, first of all, they wanted to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet to get the United States out of the way so they wouldn't have to worry about interference from the U.S. Then they could complete their conquest of China and dominate the entire region. They could control the Dutch East Indies, Burma, for example, and they thought that the United States would take about a year and a half to rebuild after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Uh, and then they thought, well, we could negotiate a peace deal with the U.S. Uh, and then be done with it. Uh, Japanese often believed that they were superior to Americans because Americans were so diverse, because we are a very diverse mixture of peoples, and Japan is very homogeneous. The great majority of Japanese people are Japanese, of Japanese ethnicity. Um, and they thought Americans could not remain committed to a war with Japan, that they couldn't stick to it. This was is a representation of Japanese prejudice against Americans, and it turned out to be incorrect. Uh, the leading military strategist on the Pearl Harbor attack was Admiral Yamamoto, who planned it. But he was very wary about it, nervous about it. He told his superiors that he could guarantee victories for only 6 months, and that is about what happened. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, there was a major American naval victory at Midway. And after that, the Pacific War turned around and Japan was on the defensive. So the original strategy that it would take the U.S. 18 months to rebuild and become a threat was too optimistic for the Japanese. It didn't take that long. Now, on December 7th, it was a Sunday morning, early in the morning, there was a surprise attack on the American uh, naval and air facilities on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. American radar actually detected some planes, but the officer who saw that thought that they were American planes out on exercises, training exercises. Uh, this came as a complete surprise. The toll was around 2,400 Americans killed, with 18 ships sunk or badly damaged, including 8 of 9 battleships, and almost 200 planes destroyed. But those who thought the battleship was the most important weapon in the naval arsenal uh, really were not correct about that. Uh, Naval warfare was changing, and the most important weapon was really the aircraft carrier. That would become obvious in the months and years to come. And through a great stroke of good fortune, the U.S. aircraft carriers who normally were docked at Pearl Harbor were out to sea. So none of them were damaged in the Japanese attack. This is Yamamoto. He was later killed by Americans in an attempt to take him out of the war. Uh, and these are some photos of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The response, of course, is this was enormous news that shocked the nation on that Sunday morning or afternoon in the eastern United States. And the next day, President Roosevelt called the December 7th a date which will live in infamy and called for a declaration of war against Japan. And the United States was now in World War II. And it was the attack on Pearl Harbor, as much as anything, that made this a truly world war. There had been a European war and an Asian war. At this point, the two wars were joined, and we could quite legitimately speak of World War II.